Chapter 23, Managing the Great Depression, Forging the New Deal from 1929 to 1939. Let's get started. First, I love that photograph I decided to put on the front there. It tells you a lot what went on during this time. So let's go. So where we left off, the stock market crashed. There's a problem with the economy. So there's going to be some early responses to the Depression. Well, let's meet Herbert Hoover. He believed that volunteerism and hard work would alleviate the Depression, because that's what worked before. We're going to see that the problems are pretty deep, and this isn't going to be enough. Herbert Hoover is very, very successful as the Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge basically let him do what he wanted to do. He was very well trusted for the most part. Towards the end of Coolidge's term, they started not to trust each other a little bit, but Hoover was very successful with the food program that fed Europe during World War I. And part of that program that was put together was with volunteers to be able to help with the effort for the Food Administration during World War I. Also, he was able to get a lot of businesses and labor to volunteer to work together in the 1920s with labor disputes. Well, that was easy when the economy was really, really, really good. Once the economy goes south, the ball game changes quite a bit. So he really believed this volunteerism and hard work would alleviate and help the Depression and help the economy kickstart. We're going to see it's not going to work. He did not take the United States off the gold standard to put more money into the system. He believed if he did that, it would make things worse. He also signed one of the more, let's just say, aggressive tariffs in the history of the United States, and one of the most disastrous. It significantly raised tariff rates. Retaliatory rates came from other countries. So when this tariff was implemented, other countries retaliated, and it made the situation worse. It brought prices up and brought the access of goods down, especially when people are losing their jobs. It also caused the United States companies to produce less. He also put forward and signed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that gave federal loans to businesses. So as the Depression started to move on here, he started to push towards more some direct intervention, but in the form of loans. Not direct relief to people, but in the form of loans to businesses. And it spent too little, and it was too cautious in its approach. With the severity of the problem, it wasn't enough. And in fairness to Hoover and others, I don't think they didn't contemplate the severity of the Depression. It wasn't something you could just look at and say, okay, here's the problem, here's how to fix it. It was uncharted territory, and we'll get more into that as we go into Roosevelt. There was rise in discontent. Hoover became a symbol of the suffering of the Depression, and not in a good way. Hoovervilles were these shanty towns where people lived in boxes and old pieces of wood and in parks and other places. Hoover blankets were newspapers put over people so to keep them warm, people that were homeless. One that isn't listed here, Hoover handkerchiefs. Take your pockets and turn them inside out, and when you look at them inside out, those are Hoover handkerchiefs. You name it. When you start becoming a caricature of suffering, you're done. And then you had the bonus army situation where 15,000 World War I veterans demanded an earlier bonus payment or earlier pension payment. It didn't pass Congress, and Hoover opposed it, but it wasn't necessarily that. I mean, they really wanted it real early, which probably wasn't that responsible. But in order for Hoover to get control of the situation, he sends in the army and tear gasses the veterans. It's the most obnoxious optics you would ever want to happen if you ever had a prayer of being reelected. So he ordered the army to disperse, and because of that and the images of those folks, the army troops coming in to remove them, it was an absolute disaster. And Franklin Roosevelt told his longtime consultant that I've just won the presidency. This is before he even announced he was going to run. I mean, it was pretty well known that Franklin Roosevelt, the governor of New York, was going to run for president. But you can point to this, that you can't recover from that. So in the 1932 election, it was Hoover versus FDR. Why was Hoover renominated? It's pretty simple, guys. No one else in the Republican Party would dare to run because they knew they were going to get slaughtered. So Hoover, you got to give the guy credit. He knew he was going to get beaten really badly. He basically took one for the team, knowing that he was going to get slaughtered and he was going to lose big. He went down, basically, captain of his ship, went down with this sinking ship. And if you look at that map there, that is pretty bad. I mean, basically, Hoover got Pennsylvania barely, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and I think that's Delaware. That's it, folks. That's all he got. The rest of it went to Roosevelt. It was destruction. 472 to 59 in the Electoral College. Unemployment and bank failures continued throughout late 1932 and early 1933. Something to be discussed about the unemployment and bank failures. After FDR was elected in November of 1932, in 1933, the president does not take office back then until March the 4th. That's a long time. That's 5 months from a presidential election until administration takes place. Now, previously in a republic, that made sense. When you moved by either horse and buggy or rail, the world was a lot slower. But during this desperate time, it was a very, very long time. And Hoover, to his credit, I mean, the guy tried everything. The guy was pretty desperate, almost maybe too desperate to try to get something going. And he called on Roosevelt multiple times saying, hey, look, Franklin, let's make a joint statement. Let's try to calm the markets. Let's try to calm people from running on the banks. What was running on the banks? People would literally run to their banks to take their deposits out in fear that they would lose their deposits. And we'll find out here, banks don't always keep all the currency keep their deposits in currency. So it was a desperate situation. Banks were crumbling or melting before our eyes during this period. But Franklin Roosevelt absolutely refused to do any joint statement with Hoover or any kind of joint operation with Hoover and he wasn't going to deal with anything until he got into office. A couple of reasons for that. A, politically, for him to associate himself with Hoover, somebody he just beaten really bad, would not make him look good. Secondly, he believed there needed to be a complete change in approach and leadership, and if he tied himself to the old, he wouldn't be able to do that, would not be as effective. So even though things were really bad, Roosevelt is going to sit and wait until he gets inaugurated himself. And he's going to be ready. Bills are going to be ready right away. They're going to be ready to be pushed through. This is known as the first 100 days. If you look at the bottom there is Roosevelt being sworn in on March the 4th of 1933. A pretty amazing thing when he got sworn in. No one knew that he was stricken with polio 10 years before, or more than 10 years before. If you watched, he walked with a top hat on and walked to be sworn in. Little did people see that he had leg braces on, and his arms, the way they were positioned, with his sons next to him, were basically holding him up. It's absolutely amazing, and if I have time, I'll show you the video that shows him doing this. The country had no idea that he was paralyzed from the waist down, and he was able to hide it, and nobody really knew it through his whole career. They knew he had polio, but they believed he beat it. He was in a wheelchair. Most people agree he probably would have never been elected if the public knew he was paralyzed from the waist down. Unfortunately, at that time, with enough people, paralysis was seen as a weakness. So it's pretty remarkable in the amount of upper body strength and just strength overall, mental strength, physical strength, for him to be able to move himself around like this and go through all these pains to make it look like that he wasn't paralyzed is unbelievable. And it says something about his character. It's not that he was lying. He just understood that the country wouldn't accept it, and he pushed on. The Brains Trust were folks that he put in his cabinet. They're unofficial advisors. They helped draft legislation. A lot of them were professors, experts in different fields, economists, philosophers, political scientists, you name it. These were who he thought were the best of the best that advised him on what would be the best legislation to help the country get out of this depression. Frances Perkins, who's to the bottom right, was the first female cabinet member. I may have mentioned she was FDR's Secretary of Labor or Labor Secretary in the state of New York. And when Franklin Roosevelt became president, he nominated her to be the Secretary of Labor, and she will be the first female cabinet member. You might even remember before, if you look at the triangle shirt, waistcoats fire, she was a teacher at Columbia University, and she basically saw the fire from her office window, and it affected her deeply when it came to safety and workplace safety, and she's going to bring that with her as Secretary of Labor during the Great Depression and during the Roosevelt administration. So what was this 100 days? The first 100 days is legislation that focused on four major areas: banks, agriculture, businesses, and unemployment. We present this to you for study in a more organized way, but as it rolled out, it didn't come out as organized. We're going to show you, but we present it that way so you understand what the focus was. Today, most of our presidents are judged, well, what do they do in their first 100 days? I think it's really unfair because when Franklin Roosevelt became president, unprecedented times. He also had 5 months to really work on this and get ready for this. So to judge presidents on their first 100 days, it's just kind of not fair. The amount of legislation that was able to be passed during this time, I don't know if we'll ever see it again or if it will be necessary. So first, banking reform. The first thing that he does is set a bank holiday where all the banks in the nation were closed, and they could not reopen until they proved to be sound. That means good assets. The management was good. So in other words, most banks were reopened, but some weren't because they weren't healthy. And if you kept on having unhealthy banks in the system, there wouldn't be confidence in the system. So that's the first thing. Name of the legislation was the Emergency Banking Act. Then, in banking, you had the Glass-Steagall Act. It created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It insured bank deposits up to $2,500. Today, I think it's, $99,000 or whatever it is. It's gone up over time. The other thing the Glass-Steagall Act did not allow banks to take savings and put it in the stock market and put it into these risky investments. That was repealed under Bill Clinton in the mid-90s. It wasn't just Bill Clinton. The Republicans passed the bill and he signed it. And many people believe that's why we had the we had the real estate crisis of 2008 because a lot of these banks were investing in these really complicated bundle-up mortgage loans that collapsed and turned the other way in 2008. So Glass-Steagall was really important. It wasn't just the FDIC. It was not allowing banks like before. Remember, buying on margin. Banks would give these loans, these margin loans, or would take people's deposits and throw it in the stock market, and all of a sudden the stock market went down. All these banks went down with it. So it was to separate that. So I don't know how I feel about that part of Glass-Steagall being repealed where, banks can invest in these really, really, really risky financial products again. I don't know where I stand on that. Agriculture and manufacturing reforms into the New Deal. You had the Agricultural Adjustment Act. A lot of acronyms here. A lot of we call alphabet soup. The AAA. You're going to have a chart. We're going to look over all these things. So you're very, very well aware of this. It sought to rectify overproduction of farm goods. It paid farmers not to produce. I mean, millions of hogs were slaughtered. Crops were, buried under. In other words, to bring down the supply and hopefully the prices will go up. Overproduction was what was driving prices down because farmers were desperate. They couldn't get any more money. So they produced more to try to get more money, and it had a reverse effect overall. It also, I already said, it paid farmers to not grow crops, benefited large landowners, not sharecroppers. So those that own the large farms benefited. They got money from the government not to produce, but those sharecroppers that produce next to nothing, they didn't share in those benefits. And this is a major, major criticism of the New Deal, and we're going to see this moving on. Is that the New Deal policies, and a lot of this, especially with farmers, didn't help the little guy, helped the big guys. And you're going to see some folks on the left that are going to say, look, this New Deal is just for people of means. It's not helping those that are really, really, really suffering. And that's going to lead to Roosevelt to go to the second New Deal. And the National Recovery Administration, known as the NRA, don't confuse that with the National Rifle Association. Industries agreed on prices and production quotas. However, this is going to be shot down. Both of them, actually. The AAA and the NRA were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because they basically said the government can't force people not to produce things. Also, the government can't set prices. That's pretty much the reason why these were struck down. The Supreme Court saw this as federal overreach, that the federal government did not have a constitutional role in the economy. So that didn't make Franklin Roosevelt very happy. Unemployment relief. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, known as FERA, provided federal money to give to states for relief programs. This is direct relief programs. And one of the big problems, I'm going to show a couple clips from some films, men were too proud to take this. They would get into really, really, really tough situations before they would actually take direct relief payments out of pride. And a lot of families suffered even more because of that. Today we look at it like, what do you mean? We don't have a problem taking something from the government. Back then it was considered to be you were defeated and you lost. So keep that in mind. Also the Public Works Administration. This kind of worked a little more because actually these men or young men would work. They were construction projects. Now men didn't have a problem doing that. They were actually working and getting paid for work versus getting just direct relief. The Civil Works Administration provided 4 million jobs to Americans in the winter of 1933 and 34. These construction projects were bridges, roads, etc. You look at so many millions of people unemployed. Well, we have roads we need bridges, we need airports. We need to build the infrastructure of the country for the future. So why not use federal dollars to pay people? It gives them relief. They're getting work in. They're paying their bills. And the country is they're borrowing money, but we're building the infrastructure for the future. And there's some photos. The unemployment relief continues. The Civilian Conservation Corps, that's what you see on the bottom. Outdoor work, conservation, planting trees, etc. Mostly young men, 18 to 24, sent money back home to their families. So it's kind of like going to camp and going to a work camp. 18 to 24 young men. Not only that, they did exercises in the morning. They put them together in groups like they would in the military, because Franklin Roosevelt knew in the back of his mind, looking at over the pond with people like Mussolini and Hitler rising to power, that maybe the country will eventually go to war. So if so, we got these young people kind of ready with that. This little bit of a thing. A lot of these CCC camps, the one in Rhode Island is a camp in Charleston. They built parks, state parks, trails, lodges, log cabins, all kinds of things. But a lot of state parks were built or refurbished. A lot of the outdoor assets that were taken care of. So that was what the CCC did. And it was very much needed money. The young folks had lodging and food, so they didn't have any expenses. So again, that money was sent home to help their families. So there was a housing crisis, obviously. People lose their jobs, they can't pay their mortgage. 500,000 families lost their homes. That's amazing. The Federal Housing Administration helped regulate interest rates for mortgages because the interest rates were going through the roof. And when they did that, they also tried to help people remortgage their homes so they can keep their home. So if you modernize and refinance, your payments can come down. You can start from scratch again and be able to keep your home. That was the other part of the FHA, was to help these folks that were in arrears. That means behind on their mortgage. Say you're behind 3 months, okay, the federal government's going to guarantee a new loan where they can refinance the home, start from scratch, and start paying from there. And it did help a lot of people save their homes, along with direct relief and getting jobs. So it was very much needed. They had to stop the bleeding on that too. So the New Deal went under attack. And remember what I told you before, some people thought that these New Deal programs were not helping those that were in tough shape. It was more helping larger landowners and companies and folks that already had some means. So the Securities and Exchange Commission regulated the stock market and sought to prevent abuses. So there were critics on the right. The right would be more conservative critics, which said, a group called the Liberty League said that the government spending, the deficit spending, was dangerous and unprecedented. That government should stay within its means. It should not have this massive borrowing and this massive deficit spending. You had the National Association of Manufacturers, who used radio and other media to promote their anti-Roosevelt message, and basically was the administration's meddling in the economy, particularly with the NRA and the AAA setting prices and trying to manipulate the markets. They saw that government did not have a legitimate role in that. You have the Schechter Poultry versus the U.S. and Butler versus the U.S. declared the NRA and the AAA unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. We already mentioned that. And then here's some left-wing critics. So on the populist left, you had Francis Townsend, who's on the right there, sitting at the desk. He proposed giving $200 a month to senior citizens over 60. This will help influence the Social Security Act. Huey Long, who's on the left, with the Share Our Wealth program, was a Louisiana senator, before that a governor. He was basically the political boss of Louisiana. He's pretty corrupt and very much a firebrand, that basically said that this New Deal isn't helping the poor folks. And he basically called out for a populist socialism where, you tax the rich and redistribute it and give it to the poor, to help the poor, that the rich has it so they can do it. So the welfare state will come into being. This is known as the Second New Deal. Roosevelt took the shots from the left. He ignored the right. He calculated that the right wing was not going to be a threat to him, but he did calculate the left wing, folks like Long and Townsend, would become an enormous threat to his presidency. So he tacted left after he assessed the situation. So the first New Deal was about economic recovery. The Second New Deal is going to be about social justice and creating a safety net, the share our wealth, Social Security, the things that he was being hammered on by the left. So you have the Wagner Act and Social Security. Since the NRA was declared unconstitutional, unions lost many rights. The Wagner Act was passed where workers had the right to join unions and they couldn't be fired for joining a union. So it gave protections for unionism, and you can't be fired for joining a union. The Social Security Act provided pensions for retired workers and compensation for the unemployed and disabled workers. So let's break this down. The Social Security system has a couple components to it. The first is old age benefits. Somebody's done working. At that time was the age of 60 or over. You get a certain benefit every month. You're retired. It's an entitlement. That means you're entitled to that when you turn 60 years old. And what that did is that took a burden off of families where when people were done working, if they didn't have any life savings, they became a really big burden of families financially. I mean, people did it, but it was really, really tough. With this Social Security, it really helped a lot of old folks stay away from poverty. A lot of people, they worked, had a pretty decent career or did okay. They weren't able to save that much, but after that, they didn't have anything. And a lot of older people went into serious poverty, especially after the Depression, when many of them lost their savings, lost their pensions to these banks. They had nothing, and they were in severe, severe poverty. So that's the first part of the Social Security Act. Also, unemployment compensation to be administered through the states. Every state in the United States has an unemployment program. It's a federal program. It comes from your taxes, but then the states are going to decide how much and how they're going to implement unemployment insurance programs. There's a minimum benefit, but some states give more than others, and some states have different requirements than others. It was decided that one size doesn't fit all, so it's up to the states to administer its unemployment system. Some states charge more than others on an unemployment tax, and the state unemployment tax is up to each state. And then the other thing that Social Security did was also provide benefits early for those that were disabled. You're not able to work. You have a mental disability or learning disability, something that keeps you away from being able to work. You have adults that are mentally challenged and different kinds of disabilities. If you're unable to work and support yourself, Social Security provides some sort of sustenance, some sort of income, so people with disabilities can actually live a life with some sort of dignity. Before that, again, those that were disabled, special needs, that couldn't work in the workforce became a huge burden to families financially, and many of those poor souls lived in real severe poverty because of it. So if you look at the Social Security Act, it isn't just old age benefits. It is old age benefits. It also disabled workers and the disabled, but it also is the first legislation for an unemployment insurance system too. Now we have the term New Deal liberalism. Classical liberalism is associated with free markets. If you're a classic liberal, today you would be a conservative Republican. If you're a New Deal liberal, today you're what you would call progressive. That's why I said way earlier, when you hear the term liberalism, it depends on the context. It also depends on the time period. So classical liberalism is associated with free markets. New Deal liberalism is associated with this welfare state that started. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just the way to look at liberalism is more progressivism. A big government role with some wealth redistribution. That's New Deal liberalism. And again, what is wealth redistribution? You tax those with more money, the so-called rich, or those that have more means, and redistribute that in programs to the poor. You can look at something like Social Security or unemployment benefits. You can look at those for the disabled, or other types of anti-poverty programs that comes from taxation in the form of an income tax. So the second New Deal, from reform to stalemate, the 1936 election, the Works Progress Administration employed over 8 million workers, construction on roads, bridges, and etc. Republican Alfred Landon, known as Alf Landon, challenged FDR, and he lost. There you go. There you go, Alf. Alf got 8 electoral votes. Maine and Vermont. That's the second worst blowout in American history. The worst one in terms of number of states. That's the worst blowout, I think, in terms of electoral votes. Pretty sure about that. 8 electoral votes? Yeah. Electorally, that's definitely it. States, Ronald Reagan won 49 states in 1984. He basically let the gas off in Minnesota, which was Walter Mondale's home state, the former vice president. If he actually campaigned in Minnesota, he would have won 50 states. But Reagan didn't want to embarrass him. Well, he did, but in his own state, too. That's bad. So the second New Deal, from reform to stalemate, there's going to be a court battle, then an economic recession, okay? So in reaction to the Supreme Court declaring New Deal programs unconstitutional, FDR got angry, and this is what he sought to do. Appoint a new justice for every judge over 70. That means you can appoint up to 6. That means to take the Supreme Court from 9 justices to 15. This court packing plan was overwhelmingly rejected. So what he wanted to do, he wanted to appoint his favorable judges so his New Deal programs would be ruled constitutional. Now, when he put this plan forward, remember, the House decides the makeup. Congress decides the makeup of the courts. Not the courts, not the president. It's by legislation. If you remember, when the Constitution created the judiciary, it created a Supreme Court, and it created the position of Chief Justice. It never said how many justices on the Supreme Court there should be. That would be up to Congress as part of the checks and balances. Neither did they set up any other courts. The inferior courts were left up to Congress, too. So it's an enormous congressional power. The Congress can create or destroy courts. I've always said, my friends that are upset with certain circuit courts, well, Congress, if they want to, can disband those courts because they have the power to do so. I don't think they ever will, but I'm just giving an example. So FDR wins a huge re-election in 1936. He's pretty emboldened. He won, 46 out of the 48 states at the time. So he puts forth this plan, and what happens is mostly your conservatives, your Southern Democrats, not even that, they stop and say, whoa, wait a minute here. This guy's trying to get too much power. So this is the end of the New Deal. This court packing plan is when FDR lost a good amount of Democrats. It got a little bit worse. FDR also recruited more liberal or more New Deal candidates in these southern states to run against these southern Democrats for the House in particular. And that got the House members even more angry. And in the midterm primaries of 1938, most of those New Deal candidates lost. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. And around that same time, you had the Roosevelt recession, where FDR had to cut back on spending due to an improved economy. So what that means is the economy started doing well. That means these programs needed to be cut back on. So you had to basically cut back on spending. So what is Keynesian economics? Government must spend money in a depression to prime the pump and stimulate the economy. So if there's a depression, government spends money, and that money in the system will jumpstart the economy or stimulate it. That's Keynesian economics. There are people today that still look at Keynesian economics as a very, very legitimate model. There are others that reject it. For instance, when President Obama was elected and inaugurated, and those of you that might remember, you might not, right when he got in office in 2009, he had this $1 trillion package known as the stimulus package, $1 trillion of spending. And these were supposed to be shovel-ready jobs and all this stuff, and it was to help stimulate and get the economy back on track. Most experts say it didn't work. Some will say it does, but the whole point is in a Keynesian economics, when the economy is bad, you spend a lot of money at the government to get things rolling. So I know I'm being repetitive on this, but I just want you to make sure you understand it. So organized labor during this time, union membership increased 23%. You had the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, organize all workers within an industry, regardless if they were skilled or unskilled. It was about time that they figured this out, because when they divided themselves between skilled and unskilled workers, it didn't make them as powerful in certain industries. Women in the New Deal, gender inequities persisted. However, Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin's wife, was the eyes and ears for FDR and transformed the image of the First Lady. She was crucial to Franklin's presidency, because Franklin couldn't get out on the road because of his polio and his paralysis. She would go in all these places, and she would write these reports, and she would put them in a box that got to the president every morning. I mean, she didn't write one every morning, but she constantly gave him reports of everything that was going on with quite a bit of recommendations. Eleanor and Franklin's relationship became more of a partnership and friendship. 1920s, she found that he was having an affair with her personal assistant. It pretty much ended the romantic part of their relationship then. It was before, I believe, he was paralyzed. After the 1920 election, she found out about it. He ran for vice president. You'll see pictures of him running for vice president, walking in parades. He was walking. I think it was 1921 or 22 is when the polio struck him. He went up to Nova Scotia, one of their houses there, and it struck him there. She and Franklin stayed together, but it was a political and a partnership and a friendship. And she kept his name alive in New York. She made sure she went to a lot of things to keep his political connections going while he was fighting with figuring out how to deal with his polio. It's a fascinating story. There are resources I have I'll put together. Just the relationship between Franklin and Eleanor is absolutely incredible. So she was crucial not only to his presidency. He would have never been president if it wasn't for her. She worked so hard with one of their political operatives in New York for years and years to orchestrate his comeback into politics. You know, he was the vice presidential nominee in 1920. he's going to basically disappear for 6 or 7 years because of the polio and figuring out how to deal with it. Then he will get elected governor of New York in 1928. So I know I'm going on about this, but Roosevelt's going to serve, he's going to get elected to 4 terms. He's only going to serve 3 plus, but he's going to be there a long time. It's an important presidency, not only dealing with the Great Depression, but also World War II. And Eleanor's abilities were second to none and were huge. Also during this time, women were paid less than men for the same jobs. It still exists, guys. So I don't want to get into discussion about it now. I'm sure we will in later times. But that was the deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps did not allow women to join. African Americans of the New Deal, the Resettlement Administration helped small farmers buy land. African Americans began to overwhelmingly vote Democratic. Why? Because the New Deal programs did not discriminate against them. African Americans were desperate, just like a lot of white folks were, especially farmers during the Depression. And the New Deal programs did not discriminate against them. That was big. Except for the CCC segregated blacks, but they still could participate. Lynching persisted throughout the 1900s. You had the Scottsboro Boys, where 9 African Americans charged with raping 2 white women on a train, and 8 were sentenced to death. Eventually, death sentences were overturned. I believe that's federal courts. The agricultural adjustment, the AAA, did not help sharecroppers. Checks were given to the landowners. A lot of white sharecroppers took the hit on this too. It wasn't just blacks. But an overwhelming amount of African Americans in the South were sharecroppers. So the landowners pocketed the checks. The sharecroppers, in a lot of instances, did not benefit from that. Now, were there some landowners that helped some sharecroppers and shared it with them? Sure, but far and few between. Indian policy. John Collier is going to be the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You had the Indian Reorganization Act, or known as the Indian New Deal, that reversed the assimilation policy of the Dawes Act, if you remember that from the 1920s. They didn't have to cut their hair and act like little American kids and all that stuff anymore. Many natives were given religious freedom and semi-sovereign nation status. This will be the legal seed planted for today. We have Native American casinos and that kind of stuff because of the semi-sovereign nation status. It's going to set the stage for later down the road. Struggles in the West. Mexican Americans benefited from the WPA and the CCC. That's the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Most Chinese were excluded from New Deal programs. That's nice. I mean, man, you look at Chinese 19th century, 20th century, man, and even look at the Japanese with internment. Asians were, don't get me wrong, slavery was absolutely horrible and loathsome, but man, Asian Americans really took it, were given to it pretty hard for quite some time in our history. Reshaping the environment, FDR sought to have land benefit the needs of humans. The Dust Bowl was a disaster and impacted mostly the Great Plains region. If you see that postcard to the right, that's a dust storm approaching Spearman. That's not a postcard, but a photograph. Spearman, Texas, on April the 14th, 1935. Absolute disaster. And the toll that the Dust Bowl and this poverty took on. See that woman there? I think she's in her early 20s. She looks like she's in her 40s. Okay? The overcultivation affected farmland. And because of that, it had the soil was depleted and loosened up. There wasn't a lot of grass and stuff around. So when it dried out, it was a, lack of a better term, a perfect storm for this Dust Bowl disaster. These Okies fled to California. The book, The Greats of Wrath, I'm going to show a little clip from the film from 1941 with starring Henry Fonda as Tom Joad. How a lot of these people left Oklahoma, went to California to these work camps to pick peaches and other things out of desperation. There's Dorothea Lange there. Again, she was in her early, maybe mid-20s at best. She looks like she's 38, 45 years old in that photo. The Tennessee Valley Authority focused on flood control, electricity development, etc. It provided a significant amount of electricity to farms, homes, and factories. So you take some needs and get some multiple results for it. You needed to control floods in the Tennessee Valley. You need to be able to get some electricity because that area was so rural and underdeveloped. So you take a problem of flooding, you make the dam, you control the area, you use that water and harness it into electrical power. Now you're developing an area. The TVA is considered to be a major New Deal success. You had the Rural Electrification Administration that provided electricity to rural areas, a good amount of the country that did not have electricity. You had the Grand Coulee, the Columbia River in Washington, the largest electricity producer in the world. So again, it wasn't just the Tennessee Valley. There were other areas where this approach was taken. Some impact on society, New Deal in the arts. Over 20,000 artists, musicians, and writers were employed. So what were the legacies of the New Deal? Millions paid taxes into Social Security. The one part of Social Security didn't tell you is that an extra tax would be assessed on people's paychecks, a federal tax. It's a payroll tax known as FICA. You might see that if you work. It's a payroll tax. It pays for your Social Security. Today's FICA tax also pays for Medicare, but there was no Medicare then. It was just Social Security. 1/3 of the population received government assistance at the time. That's federal government assistance. A lot of it was through states, but still, from the genesis of it was the federal government. For the first time, this is a radical change in the people's relationship to its federal government is the response to the New Deal. The New Deal was criticized by both the right and left. The right said the spending and the interference of the federal government was dangerous or illegal, depending on who you spoke to. The left criticized, said this didn't go too far at all. You still had a lot of people suffering. They needed some direct relief, some entitlements, help the aged, redistribute or share the wealth. There was a change in voting patterns. This New Deal coalition of unions, blacks, and many immigrants predominantly voted Democratic. So you're going to see a massive political realignment where African Americans who always voted Republican is going to start really shifting majorly to Democratic. The labor unions are going to vote Democratic. And immigrants, so your cities, your urban areas are going to vote Democratic. So a quick recap. The bonus army, again, that was bad optics of Hoover. Kiss his presidency goodbye from that. It was probably gone anyways, but this made it even worse. Hoover's versus FDR's response to the Depression. Hoover's was just too little too late. He tried a lot of stuff, but it took him a while to get there. FDR just went, you can even argue, too far. And we're going to look at some interpretations of the New Deal. Did it work or did it not? Did it just hold off? Did it cure the Depression? We're going to look at that stuff. The different New Deal programs, again, we'll have some charts and other things we're going to look at. We're going to look at this more in depth. Critics of the Great Depression, the right, left, and in the Supreme Court. Can't forget the court packing thing, which is the beginning of the end of this New Deal. The New Deal's impact on women, African Americans, Native Americans, and others. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a big deal. Voting patterns are going to change. This New Deal coalition is going to stay solidified for a good 40 to 50 years. It really isn't going to get broken until the election of 1994, when the Republicans are going to take the House and Senate for the first time in 40 years from the 1950s. the New Deal coalition is going to be that strong for that long in a lot of places. So that is it for Chapter 23. Again, if you have any specific questions on the readings, please do so. If I missed stuff, I'm sure I did because a lot went on during this time. Again, we can go over in class. And until next time, thank you.